The voice beyond words. How we speak reveals our character. The voice beyond words. Katherine Kinsler's thoughts on how we speak and what it reveals about us. We don't often think about how we speak, but for University of Chicago psychologist Katherine Kinsler, how we express ourselves can be as revealing as what we say. In her new book, How You Say It, Why You Talk the Way You Do, and What It Says About You, Kinsler explores how speech, starting in childhood, shapes our social biases. She argues that amid discussions about racial discrimination, discrimination based on speech is an often overlooked aspect. Kinsler emphasizes that when we open our mouths, we convey not only the content of our speech, but also a lot about who we are. Children, in particular, are extremely sensitive to voices and absorb cultural messages, including about race, through them. Long before they utter their first words, babies are already attuning to the speech around them. Studies show that as early as 8 months of age, babies begin as universal listeners, capable of differentiating a wide range of native and foreign sounds. However, over the first year of life, they adapt to the sounds of their native language and, consequently, lose the ability to distinguish non-native sounds. This early adaptation has a profound and lasting impact. Kinsler states that we are forever marked by the voices we hear in infancy. Our brains and the way we speak incorporate the language we absorbed as children. While language can change throughout life, it is extremely challenging, especially in adulthood, to learn a non-native language, or, in particular, a non-native accent. The way we speak will, to a large extent, always reflect what we assimilate during childhood. For Katherine Kinsler, social messages that stigmatize groups of speakers can easily infiltrate children's minds. Feeling linguistically excluded, especially in a world where prejudice is often unconscious, can be a major challenge for those whose way of speaking is seen as non-standard or different. Along with his former doctoral student Jasmine De Jesus, Kinsler investigated the development of socio-linguistic stereotypes in children. Previous research has indicated a native preference in children, meaning they tend to like people who speak in a familiar manner common in their local community. However, this differs from stereotyping, which involves attributing characteristics to a group of people based on their speech. A widespread example is the idea that people with a northern accent, in the U.S. for example, appear more educated, intelligent, or of high status, while those from the South may be perceived as more likable but less intelligent. To test this theory, Kinsler and De Jesus studied children from Chicago, considered North for the study, and the southern U.S., exposing them to voices from both regions. The results revealed that kindergarten children, ages 5 to 6, they showed a preference for familiar voices. Children from the North preferred Northern voices, while children from the South had a roughly equal relationship with both, possibly due to greater exposure to different dialects through the media. At this age, they did not demonstrate specific attitudes or knowledge about the origins of speech. Fourth graders, ages 9 to 10, a significant shift occurred. Both Northern and Southern children began to associate Northern speakers with intelligence and responsibility, and Southern speakers with kindness. What truly surprised Kinsler was the convergence of stereotypes in both communities. Children, regardless of their geographic origin, were learning the same stereotypes, including those that favored their own group and those that portrayed the other group more positively. Kinsler points out that children, while incredibly attentive to voice and absorb cultural messages about race, are not born racist. They live in a society that teaches them racism. But young children do not necessarily see skin color as a highly significant factor about human groups. This is something that exposure to a racist society teaches them. In contrast, speech seems to be something children pay close attention to. By listening to someone speak, children infer a lot of meaning, often more than they infer from skin color, especially when they are young. Kinsler also addresses parents' decision to maintain a heritage language for their children. Her advice is an unequivocal yes. She believes there are many advantages for children to learn another language, in addition to it being a way for families to maintain an important part of their culture. However, for parents whose entire family speaks English and who live in a predominantly English environment, Kinsler emphasizes that all hope is not lost, encouraging them not to feel discouraged. Katherine Kinsler explores the vital role of language in child development, the formation of prejudices, and the building of a more tolerant society. Her research and reflections highlight the importance of a conscious and proactive approach to linguistic diversity. Kinsler points out that even limited exposure to a language other than English can be highly beneficial for children. It helps them practice perspective-taking, understand who communicates with whom, and who understands certain content, skills that are crucial for communication development. She advises parents to expose their children to different languages, emphasizing that a fully bilingual environment is not necessary to reap these benefits. The author also highlights a troubling discrepancy in how parents react to different types of childhood prejudice. If a white child expresses a preference for other white children, parents feel, justifiably, uncomfortable. However, if a child demonstrates a preference for English speakers with an American accent, parents' concern is often lessened and even seen as a sign that the child is good at learning languages. Kinsler argues that being aware of the role of linguistic prejudice in society is crucial so that parents can educate their children about the importance of language and tolerance. Kinsler traces this to a landmark Supreme Court case, Meyer v. Nebraska, 1923, which overturned state laws prohibiting the teaching of languages other than English to young children. This legislation, born after World War I, reflected the fear that speaking another language could generate anti-American sentiment. For Kinsler, this caution regarding foreign language learning still echoes in national discourse today, linking speaking English with being American, something that shouldn't be a prerequisite. The professor advocates the idea of prioritizing language, that is, valuing linguistic diversity and promoting exposure to and learning multiple languages from an early age. She sees schools as the ideal way to initiate this change, as they bring children together at a crucial stage of learning. This isn't just about learning languages, but about instilling a cultural value of tolerance and enthusiasm for linguistic diversity in all children. Kinsler cites a 2014 bipartisan report that revealed that the U.S. is a far more monolingual nation than many others. The report argues that this reality can be changed, but requires awareness and investment. A striking quote from the report resonates with Kinsler's thoughts. "It is critical that we work together at this moment in history, when there is so much to gain by participating in a multilingual world, and so much to lose by remaining stubbornly monolingual." Have you ever considered how the diversity of accents and languages in your daily life may be shaping the perceptions of the children around you? For Katherine Kinsler, the way we speak is a window into the complexity of human communication, social identity, and, unfortunately, prejudice. She argues that society needs to reevaluate the priority given to language education and recognize the subtle but powerful influence of linguistic discrimination. Kinsler notes that in the context of language acquisition, many school districts only begin offering language classes in elementary school. This is a time when the critical period for language learning is already closing for many children, making acquisition less effective than at earlier ages. She argues that although many schools lack the resources, language learning should be a priority facet of education. Language, according to Kinsler, is intrinsically linked to communication and social connection. The idea that everyone could speak the same language in the same way is utopian. This is because new community groups naturally alter their speech to reflect their ties, driving language evolution. This ability of distinct groups to communicate in a way that reflects their shared cultural identity is, for Kinsler, positively powerful. However, the same dynamic opens the door to discrimination against those who speak differently. Kinsler emphasizes that anti-speech prejudice can be an insidious form of racism, as people often don't realize they're practicing it. She uses as an example the prejudice against African American English, a dialect as valid as any other. While no dialect is inherently superior or inferior in its ability to express thought, some are stigmatized, reflecting a history of structural racism. The professor explains that this prejudice manifests itself when people say things like, "I just don't understand her," or "it's not that clear." In these cases, even if the person doesn't feel racist, their judgment of speech and comprehensibility is deeply influenced by racial issues. Studies show that people's credibility and comprehension assessments are affected by someone's dialect or accent, even when their comprehension is perfect. It's a sneaky way in which racism can impact judgments about others' credibility. Kinsler reminds us that communication is a two-way street. We often think, "I've said what I had to say, now it's your job to receive it." But in reality, if you don't like someone's voice, you may simply shut down, often without even realizing it. This can disrupt the flow of the conversation, creating a negative, vicious cycle. If a speaker senses that the listener is shutting down, their next statement may be less informative, perpetuating the lack of connection. For Kathryn Kinsler, the way we speak goes far beyond the mere transmission of content. She reveals how accents and dialects can subtly fuel prejudices and influence crucial decisions such as employment and education, often without people even realizing it. Kinsler points out that within the context of labor law, dealing with speech-based discrimination becomes complex. It's considered acceptable for employers to make hiring decisions based on good communication. However, the trap lies in the fact that many of our perceptions of good communication are actually influenced by social biases. If someone's way of speaking is perceived as stigmatized or inaccurate, we may disconnect and conclude that we can't understand, even though comprehension is perfectly possible. This disconnect, driven by unconscious bias, can lead to misjudgments about an individual's communication ability. A clear example of this, according to Kinsler, occurs in education, especially in the evaluation of international teaching assistants, TAs. It's common to hear university students complain about these TAs' lack of fluency or difficult accents. However, sociolinguistic studies analyzing these evaluations have revealed that the perception of comprehensibility is linked not only to language, but also to race. Kinsler cites a study in which students listened to the same recording of a TA, but their perception of the accent and comprehensibility changed if they believed the TA was Asian, inferring a foreign accent, compared to when they thought the TA was white, even if the voice belonged to someone who grew up in the U.S. Kinsler points out that many people believe they have no accent, especially those from certain regions of the Northeast, excluding cities like New York and Boston, the Midwest, and California. However, she emphasizes that this is a misconception. Everyone has an accent, and the idea of standard American English is a loaded phrase that implies a linguistic hierarchy. The field of linguistics is and must be evolved to deconstruct the notion that any one way of speaking is the standard way. Language can be viewed in two complementary ways. On the one hand, we are shaped by the voices we heard in childhood, making it extremely difficult, if not impossible, to completely eliminate our native way of speaking and sound perfectly native in another language. On the other hand, within our own dialect, our voices change significantly throughout life. These changes often reflect social aspirations, life paths, and the influences of the social groups with which we interact. Language is therefore a dynamic reflection of our personal and social journey. Have you ever stopped to think about how your own accent or the way you speak can be perceived by others, and how this can influence your interactions? Katherine Kinzler explores the complexity of speech as a mirror of social identity and a breeding ground for prejudice. She invites us to reflect on how our way of speaking, often unconsciously, shapes our connections and our judgments. Kinzler highlights that adolescence is a significant period for the emergence of new speech characteristics. This happens in part because adolescents are asserting themselves and forming their own groups. One way to do this is to adopt a distinct speaking style. It's a generational phenomenon. Older adults have always complained about the way young people speak, but this is precisely how languages evolve, driven by adolescents' quest for independence. A frequent question is whether there is such a thing as gay talk. The consensus in linguistics is that among some gay men, less common among women, there are characteristic vowel patterns that manifest more frequently than among heterosexual men. While this doesn't apply to everyone and the distributions overlap, studies show that it is possible to identify gay men's voices above chance. Kinzler explains that this variation doesn't appear to have a biological basis, such as differences in the vocal folds. Instead, the most likely explanation is social and cultural in nature. When an individual integrates into a group of speakers, they tend to adopt the vocal properties of that group. Thus, any speech community can develop a characteristic way of speaking, reflecting its shared identity. Voice isn't always a conscious choice. Often, when we want to affiliate with a group or feel part of it, our voices transform. Kinzler refers to this as the chameleon effect in psychology, which can also influence actions and mannerisms. If you like someone, your voices tend to move closer together, accommodating. This manifests itself, for example, in the way vowels are produced, capturing the sounds you hear. This social accommodation reflects not only who you are, but also where you're going, where you feel socially comfortable, and where you want to be. Kinzler uses the example of politicians who seem to change their accent depending on the region they're in, which can seem disingenuous. However, she argues that while conscious voice manipulation is possible, much of this change is unconscious. When we connect with a group, our voice naturally adjusts to match the tone, reflecting typical social speech, and not necessarily deliberate intention. Kinzler hopes people realize the immense importance of the way we speak in all facets of our social lives. She acknowledges the positive aspects, language as a critical component of culture and social connections. However, it's crucial to be aware of how quickly we judge others based on their speech, labeling it as right or wrong. This judgment isn't just casual, it can have a tremendous impact on people's livelihoods, their ability to secure housing, and their sense of belonging. Kinzler concludes that we need to be aware of our linguistic biases and actively work to correct them, fostering a more inclusive and understanding society. How do you think awareness of the chameleon effect and the social nature of speech could change the way we interact with each other in diverse environments? Katherine Kinzler seeks through her studies to deconstruct the idea that monolingualism is the safest or most efficient path to cognitive development. On the contrary, she advocates linguistic diversity and exposure to different languages and dialects as a valuable asset for individuals and society. Kinzler criticizes the monolingual myth, often present in the U.S., the belief that speaking only one language is cognitively more advantageous or that learning many languages could overload a child's brain. This notion, she argues, is simply wrong. We were created with the capacity to learn multiple languages, Kinzler reiterates. For her, the central message is clear. Multilingualism should be seen as a value, not a liability. It's something that, as a society, we should strive to actively promote. The innate human capacity to learn multiple languages is a resource that can enrich individual experience and strengthen social and cultural connections. Have you considered how promoting multilingualism in your community could positively impact children's development and cultural understanding? Catherine Kinsler's insights reveal that the way we speak goes far beyond communication. It shapes our identity, influences our judgments, and often perpetuates prejudice. From the subtle impact of accents on employment opportunities to the importance of multilingualism for child development, Kinsler challenges us to rethink our relationship with language. Ready to deepen your understanding of how speech shapes our world? Get Catherine Kinsler's book now and join the conversation about language, identity, and combating linguistic bias. Purchase link in the description.